Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen around the world. My name is Wesahana Pearson, recording for BlackAsiaMagazine. I am here in Taiwan. I'm talking to a young woman who runs a publication that is based in Hong Kong and serves the African community there in Hong Kong. But you are presently right now in England. Miss Mareika Chirikure.
Perfect.
Okay. All right, got it. Now, I'd like to know about your publication, which is called African Spear. Before we get into that, tell me a little bit about your background, where you're from, and how you came to be in Hong Kong.
Yes. So I am Zimbabwean and I have a German mother, but I'm born and raised in Zimbabwe. So I identify very strongly with being Zimbabwean. And but then for my university, I studied in Germany. As it is with my mother, and that's how I ended up in Asia, actually, because I did an exchange year with my university and ended up in Hong Kong. And when I was in Hong Kong, I guess I really fell in love also with the city, and I met the founder of the Africa Center at that time, Innocent Mutanga. And after I'd returned to Germany, he called me and offered me a job position at the Africa Center, which is how I returned again to Hong Kong for a second time. Yes.
Okay. What are some of the things about Hong Kong that made you fall in love with the city? Can you remember?
I guess these are some very unconventional things. So I'm a person who's very aesthetic, actually. So I like to see things, and I concentrate a lot on the light. So I think the light in Hong Kong is very nice, as in the sunsets, they're very beautiful, as in you have a lot of this yellow lights coming in. And that's something that's really appealing to me, and something that was really lacking for me in Europe as a very visual person. I think also Hong Kong, of course, the food, and I guess the food culture around it. I love that. I think it's something that's very inspiring. Also, Hong Kong is a very fast-paced city, at least if you're living in the center, which I was and which I am also now. And I guess I've always been somebody who is attracted to big cities and kind of a more fast-paced life. So those were some aspects that drew me to Hong Kong.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. The Africa Center that you just mentioned, it's a place I've known for a few years already. It's becoming more and more famous in Hong Kong. If when I go there, what are some things I can encounter or see if I'm there?
Yeah, so there's a various level of programs that we have for the Africa Center, but maybe the first thing that you will see if you walk into the center is just the space, basically. So it's also supposed to be also like a co-working space, so people can always come in if you just want to work and you just need a place, and it's quite central, and that's nice. So that's kind of the day-to-day of the Africa Center. But on the other hand, we also have a lot of programs. I think in a week we'll have at least 8 programs, for example, and that we're doing in the week, which cover different areas. So we have the arts and crafts areas, where we have art jams, music jams, drum jams, dance sessions, things like that. This normally happens on the weekend. We have some educational programs where we will have, for example, Africa 101, where we focus on a specific country and have a person from that country coming in and telling us a bit more about their experience living in that country, and also how they came to Hong Kong, how they find the differences between Hong Kong and their country. We also have educational programs in the sense that we go to schools and we go to universities and educational institutions, and we try and talk to them also very actively about African cultures, and also including more about Africa in their curriculum. This is especially done in trying to motivate people to, for example, read more African literature texts, because we think this is a great entry point into exploring different aspects of African cultures. Other than that, we have other programs like Chungking Mansions Tour, we have a book club, we have a lot of several programs that, and lastly, oh yes, this is quite important, we have a lot of food programs, so cooking, baking workshops, but also dinners that you can join and kind of interact with a part of different African cultures, which is African cuisines. Yes.
All right, Mareika, why is this necessary to delve into African culture, to teach people there about African culture, especially in a city like Hong Kong? Why would you say that that's necessary, especially there?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think for me, there's two aspects to it, and this is something that the center also reflects. The first aspect is that the relations between Asia as a whole and Africa seem to be becoming more stronger and prominent, and there's more connection that is happening in that way. And this is something that's exciting. This is something that's going to happen either way in a globalized world. And what we want to do with this is also give people an entryway of finding out a bit more about us, which is beyond just, economics, and beyond just an expectation where you might have in that way. So that, people can really build a connection in this way. And this will, I think, be profitable to all parties who are involved, because you can learn more about each other. And hopefully that will also help to shape the relations of Asia and Africa in the future. That's the one hand. On the other hand, there is this idea that a lot of the perception of Africans in Asia per se can be said to kind of have been filtered through Western media. And what we're trying to do is kind of see how we can kind of change that image, because unfortunately, Africans will have been portrayed as in a negative light a lot of the times in Western media. And what we're trying to do is kind of change that narrative, especially with Asia, where you maybe don't have this difficult history, for example, of colonialism and all of these things, but where you can have a relationship that maybe does not need to be influenced by these aspects. And so what we're trying to do is kind of see how we can find entry points to kind of build a relationship between Asians and Africans that is independent of the Western world.
Okay, all right, excellent answer. Thank you for that. Stepping now into the present with African Sphere magazine. When I subscribe to this magazine, what can I expect to read or come in contact with?
Yes, so the magazine is a very exciting project that we have, in that we have a different pool of contributors who are Africans or people who are highly interested in topics concerning Africa, who write for the magazine. And so basically it's people who are largely based in Hong Kong. And these people will be able to kind of tell you about their experiences of just living in Hong Kong and being an African who's living in Hong Kong, or being a person, being a person of African heritage living in Hong Kong who somehow identifies with the notion of Africanness. And what you can expect to find is we have an issue that is released once every month, and we take on different topics or different themes for these issues. So we don't necessarily, it's not necessarily about, a current affairs, for example, that's happening, although that sometimes does come into the articles, depending on what is motivating the people around, of course, but it's more of a timeless, they're more timeless issues in that we take on a topic like the one that we're working on at the moment is courage, or we've had like breaking barriers, we've had things like resilience, we've had heritage, all of these different topics. And our pool of contributors will then write about this, and also in relation to their lives, and also in relation to the city of Hong Kong. So I think it's quite a niche thing that you can find, in that, it relates specific themes to kind of the experience also of Africans living in Hong Kong at a specific time. Yes.
Okay, all right. So people later on down the line, it's almost like a time capsule. You can see what was happening, what people were thinking and feeling in this moment. It works out very well for future generations.
Yes, definitely. And that was kind of one of the ideas behind it, that it's kind of a documentation of kind of the existence of Africans also in Hong Kong at the time, and how they're thinking about different things and thinking about different topics at the time. Yes.
Okay. All right. So with African Spear Magazine and with the Africa Center in a broader scope, what has been the reaction to what you're doing from people there in Hong Kong since you've been in existence?
Yes, so maybe just to tell you, the Africa Center as a physical space has been open since 2019, right? And before that, there were some activities that were already happening, like the book club, for example, where it would be organized by people who are now members of the Africa Center, but we would go to different spaces and host this. So we didn't have a physical space by ourselves. And so since 2019, we have this room, which is in quite central in Hong Kong. And I guess that has also, of course, changed the impact that we can have and also heightened the impact we can have. So your question was kind of on the reception of Hong Kongers to the Africa Center. So I think that it's quite interesting because you will see that people are very intrigued and they want to learn. They're curious about what it is that we are doing, and they're curious about what we're presenting here. And so you find a lot of people who want to join in on our programs. But interestingly, it's that a lot of the programs we find that people that are most popular seem to almost kind of reinforce the ideas of what people might typically think as what is African, right? So for example, things like drumming classes or dance classes or food classes are things that are the most popular. It might also be because those are enjoyable, most fun. You don't have to think as much, and sometimes if you're doing an activity on the weekend, you also don't want to be engaging too much if you've had a stressful week, for example. But on the other hand, we find that maybe some of our programs like the Africa 101s, or where we talk about where we have discussions on religion on the African continent, or where we have discussions on Pan-Africanism, for example, or even things like the book club might not be as well visited. And that may also be because people might find that to be something that is out of their depth and maybe difficult to understand. So I think the reception in general, if I were to say, has been quite good. And you can see that also in the growth that we have managed to have, I guess, in the past year, for example, where we have had a lot more programs happening, even with schools and universities. But definitely that there's still a barrier that we're trying to break through, in also presenting that, there's more to Africa and Africanness than just music and food. Yes.
Okay. Now, what you just said was that there's more engagement on certain aspects of African culture and less engagement on other aspects. Mm-hmm. Is that something you even want to fix? Is there a goal towards creating more engagement, increasing engagement with these other aspects, with the more intellectual aspects of African culture?
Yeah, so one of our missions at the center is kind of raising Black consciousness. And for us, that also includes this idea of not only within a community of Black people or Africans living in Hong Kong, not only that raising of consciousness within yourself and finding out about your own histories, for example, but also externally, right? Also to say people who are not in any way linked to Africa, also raising that consciousness for them to be able to understand that there is more beyond this. And I guess it is something that we are actively trying to engage with, as I said at the beginning, one of our goals is also thinking about the relations between Africa and Asia. And it's important, I guess, that if we are going to be having sustained relationships, not economic relationships, for example, but also cultural relationships and social relationships, it's important that it's not only seen from this one dimension of music and food and things that are enjoyable and fun and things like that, but also to understand that we are, of course, intellectual beings, and the African continent has a lot of ideologies to offer and a lot of different aspects in that to offer, also to Asians and to Hong Kongers specifically. Yes.
What has the reaction been like from the Black community? Now, you have people who are members of the Africa Center, and of course, I think the majority of them are Black people. From what I've seen online, there's like interns and things who are not Black people, who might be local Hong Kongers. How have you been received by Black people who are residents of Hong Kong?
Yes, so the Black people who are residents of Hong Kong, I guess it also depends on kind of their knowledge of the programs that we're doing, right? So sometimes some of the programs may seem a bit simplistic to them. So if you're a person who, let's say, was born and raised in Africa, some of the programs may seem a bit simplistic to you when you're finding out about, oh, Africa has 55 countries, or all of these things, or Africa is divided into 5 or 6 regions, depending on who's counting, or things like this. So some of these things might seem a bit simplistic, so you might see the Black community especially kind of drawing away from this because they already have this knowledge that's present. On the other hand, though, you will see that there is, I think, a great desire to have a center like this that is present. And we see this, for example, in a lot of the student organizations, like African student organizations at the universities will often come to us, and they want to be holding their meetings and their spaces at the Africa Center. So they definitely want to be also to using this space as a community center, as a place where you can meet up with also other Black people in the community. We also have a kids club, for example, which is visited not only by Africans when we're talking about Black people, but also like, for example, like Black Americans or Black British people who also come here and say that it is also a space where they feel that their children can learn something, which they're not probably not getting at their schools. So there has been a bit of a mixed reception, and I guess it also very much depends on which programs we're looking at when we're talking about the reception. Yes.
Okay. Now, turning back to African Spear magazine, the name of the magazine. We discussed this very briefly last time, first time we spoke.
Yes.
When you say spear, the imagery that it invokes in the mind, war, maybe militancy, also ingenuity. I think we discussed when you think of a spear from Africa, probably the most common example would be the assegai, which was created by King Shaka. Why did you choose that name? What is the meaning behind that name?
Yes. So as I was telling you, Innocent and I were sitting down actually, and we were having a discussion of, well, what should we call the magazine? What would be a good name for it? And this name African Spear came up. And the idea behind it, I guess, it is definitely military, right? When you think about it, it is definitely, that's the first thing you think about. You would probably have images of war and things like that because of this image of a spear. And I guess for us, that was quite powerful because we do think that in certain fronts, there are certain things that we are fighting against and certain barriers that we are really actively trying to break and trying to create spaces for ourselves also in the city. And so in a way that could be fitting, like, for example, like the war that we're fighting against racism, for example, or different forms of discrimination that Africans, but also Black people as a whole would be facing in a city like Hong Kong. And that's something that we really want to address. On the other hand, we also chose the African spear image because we think that oftentimes when people do think of spears, especially with Africans, it might be seen as something that is almost in the historical past, something that seems
antiquated, too old.
Exactly, antiquated. Yeah. Yes, something that seems antiquated. And we've also noticed that oftentimes in like the coming of colonialism and also with white imperialism and things like that, we have been made to feel not proud of our own histories, right? And what we wanted to do with reclaiming this name is kind of taking something that seems like a symbol of like this past and this history and presenting it and saying, no, actually, this is something that we're proud of. And this is something that has space in our world today. Lastly, also, this was something that I personally really liked about the image of the African spear. As I said, I'm somebody who loves aesthetics, and with spears, you will see that the way that they had been decorated in different parts across the African continent were very artistic, actually, and some of them very intricate pieces of art in how they were used and how they were formed. And I think in that way, it also kind of represents also this beauty that was present in even the everyday life and everyday artifacts that people were using. And so that's kind of why we came to this name, the African spear. Yes.
Okay. All right. Excellent answers. Great. Thank you for that. Moving towards wrapping up towards the end of this interview, one question I want to ask. When we talk about, for Black people in general across the world, we're, I think, now going more into the 21st century, looking for an identity that creates more cohesion for us as a group. Like, what do we call ourselves all together? How do we cooperate or interact as a group? How big is our group? Who's in our group? Is us working together as a group even possible? When you say African, I want to know what your thoughts are on this. What do you mean? What does that mean? First of all, what does that mean? Can you define that? And is there one identity for being African?
Okay. I don't think there is one identity of being African. Mm-hmm. I think that when I think about it, it's more of an umbrella term that covers different forms of identities and maybe even parts of identity. So, for example, with me, I am both Zimbabwean and German. So, I can take on this African identity, but also that doesn't erase that I have other identities that play within me, for example. And I guess that when I think of African, I definitely think of continental Africa, of course, but also I think of the African diaspora as being something that a region, definitely, well, a global region that is also very much influenced or very much also influences what this African identity is, right? I think we will hear a lot of Africans talking about how, oh, I didn't even know I was African until I left Africa, or I didn't even think of this whole image of one Africa until I was maybe outside of Africa. I know, for example, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has said something in that direction, and also Chigozie Obioma has also said something in that direction. So it's very, I think definitely the African diaspora has helped to shape what we think of this idea of what is Africanness, or how can we unite this idea, because maybe there was also a need for that. I would define it in the same way that the African Union does, as the 6 regions of Africa, including the African diaspora. I don't know if everybody would define it in that way. I know you.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, did they ask any Black Americans or any Western Black people if that's okay with us? It was just like, they'll be fine with it, don't worry about it.
I think though with identity, it's about, you can choose your own identities, right? So for me personally, if an African American were to come to me and say, I am not African, I think it is perfectly, it's your identity to choose, right? But I also think that there's room, at least in my understanding of it, there's room and space to allow for diasporic Africans to also identify with this African identity.
Is it possible that someone who's from Africa says I'm African, and me, if I say I'm not African, because going off the logic that I'm physically not from that place and none of the cultures and identities there represent me, is it possible that that person and myself could still be part of the same group?
I think that these things are very contextual, about how we find ourselves. And I think especially when we think about this in the Hong Kong context, so this is also what I was talking to you about, is that I have a feeling that there's already a removal because we're finding ourselves in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, of course, is not in Africa, right? So we have already had this level of removal. And I think in a space like that, it's easier to have that relationship between maybe you and I in that context, because even if we're not Africans, even if we don't identify as Black, maybe we're both foreigners in this place, right? Of course, if I was in Zimbabwe, I would find the distance between me and you, for example, a bit greater than I would find it when I've now put myself in the Hong Kong situation. So I think it's very contextual. And I think also having this idea of identifying as a group, I think if anything, we navigate within this group and we use it as an umbrella term to kind of see how it fits in what situation. Yeah.
Okay. This is, like you said, going out into the future. And people now all over the world can hear the things we just said. It's an idea I wanted to put out there because I think what I know is that we're the same people, but we just have to reimagine the kind of cooperation that we have. It's not the way that our grandparents and our parents, who maybe from my background were more Pan-African and something like that, it's probably not going to happen us uniting the way that they thought it was going to happen. So you have different groups of people who need to find a way pretty much from scratch for them to cooperate with each other is what I'm looking at. But okay, yeah. Where can I find you? How can I'm not as aware of African Spear Magazine as I think I should be, but how can I subscribe to your platform?
Okay, so I think the easiest way to find is if you're active, for example, like on Instagram, you can find the African Spear Magazine on Instagram. Also, through all of the channels of the Africa Center, it is possible to find the African Spear. So like the Africa Center website, which is africacenterhk.com, and also like the Facebook page, the Instagram page, and all of these things. You can also find links to the African Spear Magazine, and that's where you can find it. When you then do go to the page, the website page of the African Spear on the Africa Center website, you can find links for you to be able to do subscriptions. So you can subscribe for both a soft copy or a hard copy, and hard copies are only for people who are in Asia, but soft copies are globally.
Digital,
yes, exactly.
Digital online.
Digital copies, yes, digital copies, yes. So you can get a digital copy wherever you are in the world, and then you can get a hard copy if you're in Southeast Asia, yes.
Okay, Mareika Chirikure, are there any final thoughts or comments that you would like to share or make?
I just want to say thank you so much for giving me this time and this platform. And also thank you so much for your question on really thinking about the African diaspora actively. I think we had more of a discussion about this yesterday. And I think it's always very useful to be thinking about these things actively, especially in the spaces that we're working. So yes, I'm very happy that you brought those topics up.
I am too. I think it definitely needs to be discussed, and every different aspect of the conversation needs to be able to speak out with equal measure. Let's say that. Everyone should have their time to speak.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. All right. Mareika Chirikure of the Africa Center Hong Kong and of African Spear Magazine. I'm definitely going to subscribe.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Not a problem. Black Asian Magazine.